So Chappell Roan at the Grammy Awards yesterday on the 2nd of February, which will be 2 days ago when I drop this, she won the award for Best New Artist. And if you don't know who Chappell Roan is, she is a pop singer, songwriter, has a little bit of rock influence and influence from different things like theater, very theatrical performances, very costume oriented and that sort of thing. And she's also very pro-trans, pro-drag. She is associated with those communities. That's a big part of what lifted up her music and her profile to the point where now she is a global superstar, and she's getting recognition from the Academy and other places. She's been kind of a phenomenon this year, no pun intended for those who know. And so I want to play the speech that she gave at the Grammys. It was a powerful speech, and it gets to, I think, what people who have a voice need to be doing with their voice. So let me play that real quick.
Thank you to my fellow nominees whose music got me through this past year. Brat was the best night of my life this year. My hat's gonna fall and it's gonna be okay. Thank you all who listened to get me here today. And Dan and Island Records, Amusement Records, my friends and my family. And above all, my Papa Chappell, who I named myself after. I told myself if I ever won a Grammy and I got to stand up here in front of the most powerful people in music, I would demand that labels and the industry profiting millions of dollars off of artists would offer a livable wage and health care, especially to developing artists. Because I got signed so young. I got signed as a minor, and when I got dropped, I had 0 job experience under my belt, and like most people, I had a difficult time finding a job in the pandemic and could not afford health insurance. It was so devastating to feel so committed to my art and feel so betrayed by the system and so dehumanized to not have help. And if my label would have prioritized artist health, I could have been provided care by a company I was giving everything to. So, record labels need to treat their artists as valuable employees with a livable wage and health insurance and protection. Labels, we got you, but do you got us?
So that was a very sweet speech. She seems nervous. She seems like it was really important to her to say this specific thing. Like this is something she's been thinking about for a while. And like she said in the event that she won this award, this was something that she wanted to say. And so this is not the first time an artist has done this, taken their opportunity, winning an award like this to make some kind of statement. Sinead O'Connor was one of the most famous radicals in music, one of the most genuinely controversial and actually subversive voices in music. Rest in peace to Sinead O'Connor. And she did a lot of advocating for Palestine and issues like that, like imperialism. And so while we see radicalism from other types of, from different types of artists. I remember Tyler, the Creator, went out at the Grammys a few years ago, and he said it felt like a little bit of a backhanded compliment to be awarded a Grammy for his album Igor, which he said wasn't necessarily a hip-hop rap album, but was grouped into the hip-hop and rap category, even though it was a #1 album. Really, they could have called it a pop album. But I think the distinction between Chappell Roan and Sinead O'Connor and their specific grievances or the things that they said on stage is that it's very particular. They're talking about policy. Sinead O'Connor was talking about the support of Israel against Palestine by the United States. Chappell Roan was talking about healthcare for artists and a livable wage. And so the reason that, to me, that's a lot more powerful than just kind of like critiques of the general, cool kids aesthetic of the Grammys, or trying to sort of break down at the misogyny and the racism that is inherent in these type of academy situations. And that's very important to do as well. And I think this year we've seen a little bit of a victory in terms of what inclusivity can look like at the Grammys, especially given the climate that we're in now. And so I'll get back to that later. But I think that it's really commendable for Chappell Roan to name specific policies that she thinks labels should adopt, or that you could say that it should be the law that labels adopt, that everybody should have a right to health care. Everybody should have a right to a livable wage. And there's no reason that a developing artist at a label, who's signed to a label, most developing artists are not able to get another job. If you want to be successful as an artist, you have to put everything into that. And you are working for the label. All of your work goes back to the label, benefits the label. That's the project. That's the partnership between a label and an artist. The label will give you a platform, but you are the representative of that label. And so for those people to not be treated like employees, Chappell Roan's absolutely right. That's not acceptable. And it's a symptom of capitalism, where capitalists, especially some of the most profitable and wealthy capitalists in the world, will deliberately skimp on providing for their employees in any possible way they can, whether it's healthcare, livable wages, putting people as contractors so that you don't have an obligation to give them the same type of benefits. All these things. We see different versions of it in different industries. And so Chappell Roan, in addressing a room full of executives, full of people who work in music, she is essentially appealing to them to do the right thing. Now, here's the thing. That's probably not going to happen, because the way capitalism works, labels are not going to decide tomorrow that they need to offer a livable wage, that they need to cut their own profit margins to provide more for their employees and their artists. They're not going to do that, because that's not how the incentives of capitalism are set up. None of the people who are rich off of handling the rights and intellectual property in the music industry did so by doing the right thing and purposely cutting their own profits so that they can provide a more fair and equitable distribution of those profits amongst the people who create them. And this is true very much so in the music industry. It's true everywhere. But in the music industry, what you have is you have a very small amount of people of artists who make a ton of money for the labels, and they get rich because even though they may only own a percentage of the intellectual property that they're putting out in their music, if their music is enormously popular, it's getting played on the radio all the time, it's getting played overseas, they're making enormous money on shows and that sort of thing, the label might be making more than them, and oftentimes is making more than them off of their own music, but it's so enormously popular that the artist is also wealthy because of the profits that are being made off of this music, even if the distribution of who's getting paid what is not equitable. So that's the position that Chappell Roan is in. She has been grinding for a long time. She's been around for a long time. Like she said here, she got signed originally when she was a minor. I became aware of her a couple years ago, and ever since then, she has just continued to blow up and become one of the most popular and one of the most unique artists on the scene. And to me personally, it's not hard to see why people like her, why people relate to her. She's very outspoken. She's done an excellent job marketing herself. And like I said, she attached herself to a community of people that will stand up for her because she stands up for them. And so that is a very valuable part of the audience that she has built. And so the point with the music industry is that not every artist is in that position. And there are thousands and thousands of developing artists who have enough talent that a label wants to contract that talent so that other labels cannot profit from it, but they may not have the resources at the moment to bring their talent to the most amount of people, make themselves go viral, create the most excitement around their music. That's actually what the label is technically supposed to do, theoretically, but labels don't really do that anymore. Labels are more interested in people who already have their own audience. So in the case of Chappell Roan, somebody who has been excellent at marketing herself, no label would have created the marketing tactics that Chappell Roan has used. All of the gaudy makeup and the, making songs about drag clubs or, drag queens in general. That's not like a traditional marketing strategy. But Chappell Roan knows her music, she knows herself, and she knows what's going to work. And that's why it does work. And that's why she's valuable to labels. So what she's essentially advocating for is a total restructuring of the music industry. And that's not going to happen voluntarily. And this is the issue and the situation that we find ourselves in with capitalism. Capitalists don't do the right thing, especially when it comes to their profits. They're just not going to do the right thing. We live in a system where they have no incentive at all to do the right thing. And why would they? And so Chappell Roan, by going on stage, essentially is just she's being a nuisance to them. She's making herself known. And I'm sure there were many people rolling their eyes and clearing their throat as she was giving that speech and saying, well, we couldn't give artists health care because that would mean that blah, 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 blah. That's how it works. But by her being specific in her demand, and she said the word demand, and I really respect that. She is putting a fine point on something that these label heads need to be made aware of, that people want and demand from them. And so our job not only is to continue to lift up and support Chappell Roan, but is to continue to apply pressure on that same fine point, whether it's healthcare and a livable wage for artists or healthcare and a livable wage for everyone. We can use Chappell Roan not only as a leader and a beacon of how we should sort of conduct ourselves in making the demands for the things that we deserve, but also she is somebody that we can look to for at least a little bit of leadership. I don't want to put too much on her because she's very outspoken. She's made some controversial comments, and in some ways that's good. But I think it's clear the difference between somebody who has interesting and poignant political things to say and somebody who is like really a movement leader. And the difference is you have to want to be a movement leader. Nobody can push you into that position, and as good of a communicator as you are, if you don't want that job, you're not going to do a great job. Unless the conditions are so bad, so destitute, that it absolutely demands it of you. And those are the conditions that some of the best leaders come out of. But my point being that we can look to Chappell Roan as somebody who is showing some leadership in this moment, even though she might not be the leader of a movement for healthcare. I think it's more likely that she'll continue to be a leader for the movement of healthcare for artists and livable wage for artists. And understand that that is good for everyone. If artists in the music industry, especially non-top earning artists, can be recognized as having a right to a livable wage and to healthcare, that is a step forward. It's actually a pretty major step forward to workers in general being recognized as having a right to those things. And so I think we're at an important moment right now, as I've sort of pointed out in the past, where we are not in an election season. We're 4 years away from a general election, depending on what the fuck happens with the general election, and 2 years away from a midterm election. And so right now is a time where we don't have to get bogged down with the conversation of electoralism, which is inevitably going to happen in 4 years. It's going to happen in 2 years too. And I mean, right now, there are some electoral conversations that we can have. There was a great article published about primarying every Democrat and why that's a great way to put pressure on them, because they're doing a whole lot of nothing right now. And they're certainly not advocating for people's rights, not in the way that they should be. And so right now, what we can do is we can take that upon ourselves to advocate for our own rights in as many vectors across as many different issues as we can. The right to healthcare, the right to a livable wage, the right to not be deported, the right to not have your citizenship revoked by birthright citizenship. I want to, issue some caution to people that I know there's a fair amount of certainty that the revoking of birthright citizenship isn't going to go anywhere. But just remember who's in power at the Supreme Court. And while, yes, birthright citizenship is explicitly written into the Constitution, understand that if they decide they want to peel that back and go along with Trump on it, there's no one to stop them. There's no one to stop them. So it very realistically might be necessary for us to stand up for the right to birthright citizenship in America. The literal citizenship of people who were born here might be revoked, and those people might get put on the list to be deported. That's a real threat. And so these protests that are happening in LA right now and across the nation, in Arizona, in Texas, there are protests happening that are shutting down the streets and trying to apply as much pressure on law enforcement to get ICE out of our states as we can, apply as much pressure as we can. And I believe on the 5th, there is going to be some kind of nationwide protest that's in the works, being planned. So I'm going to try to post some information about where people can find those protests happening near them. And so as many people can participate in that as possible, because one interesting thing that has happened in LA that is a lesson about how protests can be done successfully is at one point the protesters were gathered downtown on the highway on the 110 freeway, and the police were all there. It looked like they were gearing up to make arrests, and then suddenly they all left. And the reason they left and didn't make any arrests, and they essentially left the protesters there, was because they were called to a different area and there weren't enough police resources for both areas at once. And so this is crucial. The police actually don't have the resources to tamp down multiple large protests in multiple areas at once. And we are entering a moment in history and in American history where the maximum amount of people's rights are being challenged. And so this is a moment that is ripe for organization of all kinds. And these protests that are happening about immigration, it's one of the most pertinent issues right now. So it should be all hands on deck for that. And the more places that we put ourselves in terms of what we're advocating for, how loudly we're advocating for, and how consistently we're advocating for, and in what numbers, the less the powers that be are going to be able to tamp down those protests. And even the most powerful governments cannot ignore the maximum amount of people throwing up their arms, putting their hands in their pockets, and refusing to comply. And there's going to need to be as much refusal to comply as possible going forward. And so in a way, Chappell Roan has demonstrated for us that her label executives, probably her manager, the people around her, probably would have preferred her not to say that on stage. It's not politically correct in the music industry. It comes off as hostile towards people that Chappell Roan has to work with on a daily basis, people that make decisions about her career. And so it's risky for her to say that. And that's why we have to provide her critical support. And we've got to take that example, that now is the time to speak up. Now is not the time to hide from the possibility of our rights being taken away. And while it sucks that we have to advocate for rights that already existed on the books and continue to demand that our rights not be taken away, rather than demanding that our rights be expanded, which is what they really should, by showing force in saying that our rights will not be taken away, we are also laying the groundwork for showing force for how those rights will be expanded. And so as we look at the Grammys, as much as it is sort of an exercise in elite culture, you know, what we saw at the Grammys was advocating for trans people. We saw black women winning awards in male-dominated industries and genres like hip-hop. And we saw Chappell Roan going on stage and advocating for healthcare for artists. That's huge. And I want people to not underestimate how powerful that is, that she said that. But ideas like that are only going to gain the maximum amount of momentum if we all are generous in our support for all of the different issues that are important and all of the different people who are speaking up about those issues and putting our money where our mouth is. That's the only way that we're going to dig ourselves out of this situation or survive through it and protect the maximum amount of people that we can.